So hopefully this will be showing up soon. Anyway, guys, it's Josh here again, all alone with Daniel having abandoned me. So about to start up my first ever live show game preview, and I'm just going to confirm that I got the feed live, and then we will be ready to rock. Um, so this week, to do something a little bit different, I decided to throw out a poll on Twitter. So this is the first ever People's Choice game previews, if you want to take it that way. There's three games I'm going to be covering tonight. That's Alabama, Mississippi State, Texas, Oklahoma State, and UCLA, Oregon. It's what the people asked for, so it's what you're going to get. Um, so let's start off by just trying to get right down to it. The first game on this set, Alabama, Mississippi State, is an interesting one because you got two teams coming off a loss. Alabama in heartbreaker shootout fashion to Tennessee, and Mississippi State in what could only be described as the most opposite game, 3-3 at the half. Kind of got a little wild there in the second half with Levis and Rodriguez really trying to pull the upset for Kentucky and pulling away from Mississippi State. This game, I think, is interesting on a couple levels because we just saw what Alabama's pass defense looked like against Tennessee. I'll probably talk about that for some sort of extended rant in just a minute. But in particular, I think Mississippi State is kind of the opposite test for Alabama. They're a defensively oriented team. They've been playing really good defense this year. Offensively, they've been very inconsistent. And whereas Tennessee was all about really sort of exotic RPO-based alignments and trying to get the ball deep and isolation coverage, what they did for Mississippi State throughout the years just run this Mike Leach system, which is about spacing. It's about designed reads. Most of it is a short passing game system, even though there are some long passes built in, wide splits in the offensive line. It's sort of weirdly the bizarro version of what Heupel's doing at Tennessee, so it's kind of interesting. And I think it'll be maybe surprising to some people how that result will go, because I think a lot of the things Alabama did wrong in the Tennessee game had to do with alignment and scheme and personnel issues they had versus Tennessee's offense. So Tennessee rolled out Hyatt, who's about 6 foot, 6'1", 185-pound receiver. He's a junior. And they would line him up in stack formations on either side. So here's your sort of mini rant on Alabama defensively in that game. Alabama runs a system that uses two outside linebackers in the line of scrimmage, two inside linebackers, two defensive linemen, generally three corners, and two safeties. That's their base look. It's really a 2-4-5 scheme, if you want to think of it that way, because there's only really two traditional defensive linemen on the field. So sort of a weird hybrid between your normal four-man line and the 3-3-5 that's become popular because Alabama's effectively taking that third linebacker, putting him on the line of scrimmage, and then playing base out of nickel. The problem with that was when they played Tennessee, Tennessee goes to these wide splits where they'd have three receivers in the field. They'd have Fance, who's a high-quality tight end, and they would stack them. So Fance would be at the start of one line, receiver behind him. On the other side, they'd have receiver. And what they basically do is say, hey, okay, you want to cover us. Try to do man up on this. And Alabama, again, is a 5 DB scheme. So if you've got two and you got five defensive backs, you can put two corners over here, you can put two corners over here, you can put a safety, and you don't have safeties over both sides. And what makes it worse is their base defense was nickel. Their base defense relies on having two safeties and only three corners. So they effectively would have a corner. One side would have a nickel defender, which is a hybrid corner safety. The other side would have the free or strong safety, and they would have a safety up here. So on either side, they had a safety on receiver matchup. And because they're stacked, this guy in the line of scrimmage, you can jam. The guy behind that runs up, it's difficult for the stacked DBs, the back DB here, to actually jam the back wide receiver, if you can see my hand. So this guy would end up with a free release. Wouldn't you know it, Tennessee liked to put Hyatt in the back of that formation. And what they would do is they would try to get the alignment where they would get Hyatt on Helms, the safety for Alabama. And if they could get that situation set up, they would get a free release of the 185-pound Hyatt on what is probably 220-pound safety, and he'd run right by him. But even with there, they had problems all across the board with that. And I think it really comes down to actually the run game for Tennessee. Tennessee was averaging depending on the back, between 4 and 7 yards per carry. And what that really did is it forced Alabama to be in a situation where Alabama was having to try to play run defense at all times. Because, again, 2 outside linebackers on the field at all times, which means you only have 2 true defensive linemen. And now, if you want to go to a dime set, if you want to pull another player off to pull in another DB, so you can actually have 4 corners or 3 corners and a nickel, who do you take off the field? Do you take off an outside linebacker where you're 2 defensive linemen, outside linebacker 2? No, that doesn't really make sense. So a lot of times when they do it, they pull one of the inside linebackers off the field. Well, now you got 2 defensive linemen and 1 inside linebacker. They got destroyed by the run when they did that. And other times they tried to run a 3-man front, 2 defensive linemen and an outside linebacker. I think they had more success that way. But I think the ultimate problem there is if you want to go dime in that situation versus a team that can run the ball well, it's hard to do that without 3 defensive linemen. Because if they had gone to, let's say, a set where you have 3 defensive linemen, you've got Will Anderson or Dallas Turner rotating, and then you've got 1 inside linebacker, which probably would have been Toto. Now, all of a sudden, maybe you've got enough girth to stop the run, and you can put another defensive player on the field, but it's not their scheme. And I think Alabama's going to have to really rethink the whole concept of having 2 outside linebackers on the field, because when you get in those wide splits and they can force the safeties out, now it gets really hard to have enough guys in the box to defend the run, given the fact that you've only got 1 or 2 defensive linemen on the field. And I say all that to sort of frame for Alabama fans, which I imagine are probably the heart of a lot of people watching, what I saw is going on in that game. Like there's one series late in the game, it was the 80-yard touchdown pass. I went when I was trying to watch film where they did try to go dime. And what they did is they had Branch, who's their nickel defender, number 14, that lined up at inside linebacker. And when he was wide, they got run on for about 9 yards of play for a couple plays. And they said, okay, well, we got to put him in. So Branch comes inside. So now you've got basically a corner safety playing inside linebacker. You're really right back in nickel. But if he rotates over, then number 13, who was their star defender, ends up taking his spot. And they were in the exact same situation they were before, only now the safety Moore is the guy that's lined up in man coverage, and Hyatt runs by Moore and then ends up scoring a touchdown. So they're right back in the same place. I think fundamentally, this concept of having 2 outside linebackers in the field is a problem. All right. And I want to give a quick shout out to a couple super chats. And I'll say right now, for chat or for super chats, try to stick to the game we're discussing. I'm going to try to advance as much as I can on 20-minute increments going through these 3 games today. But with super chats in particular, I'm going to try not to bounce around too much because it'll be disruptive. But Mike Farino asked, how's it going, everybody? Always a really big supporter of the channel. I appreciate that. Benjamin V says, I wish I could tune in live. Look forward to watching tomorrow. I appreciate the support. Look forward to watching. Hopefully you give us a good comment. If I see it, I'll be sure to respond. Yeah, so let's talk about this matchup with Mississippi State. Mississippi State is not going to run those wide splits with wide receivers. It's not what they do. They run a system. You don't just overnight wake up and do that. Now, I think Ole Miss in a couple weeks with Lane Kiffin, yeah, that's something that's in their toolbox and they'll do it. And Mississippi State has some things like that they can run, but in general, that's not what their scheme's built on. Their scheme is read-based, and it's very much a methodical sort of progression the quarterback goes through. They're not going to suddenly become an RPO, throw it down the field, every play, split wide team. Also, Tennessee, in a large part, was able to do what they did because Fance at tight end was a real threat. And his ability to occupy at least a safety really helped with that numbers game. If they had a worse tight end and Alabama could have put an inside linebacker out wide, then that frees up the safety to stay over the top, or it frees up the nickel defender to stay in a corner. You get your numbers back that way, right? Because you'd have nickel in the corner, would take the side with 2 receivers, and the side with a tight end and a receiver. That's always going to be a linebacker in a corner. And I don't know that Mississippi State really has the level of threat that that you quite get with Fant. I mean, they've got good players, but I'm not sure it's the same level, and that sort of limits it. And I went ahead and run the model. So I'll start with the model here, and then we'll get into more of a discussion of why the model sees this, if we think it's accurate, et cetera, et cetera. And let me see. Kind of curious if I was going to be able to do this, but I'm not sure I can. Bear with me, guys. All right, so this is going to cover my pretty face for a second. Here's the predicted model: Alabama, Mississippi State, 41-18 Alabama. You can see the predicted yardage percentages allowed. Alabama's defensive numbers slipped quite a bit from the low 70s, mid 50s level. They were actually in the 40s in rush defense. Now they're all the way low. What I think is interesting about Mississippi State in particular is their rush defense is not great, 114%. Their pass defense at only 87%, also not fantastic. And you can see the yard per play differential that's predicted 7.3 to 4.6. That's how you get a 41-18 differential between the two teams. So there's the model numbers, and let me talk about why that probably is sort of a realistic reality. And again, it comes down to two things. One, Mississippi State's defense has been good and hasn't been fantastic. Last week, Chris Rodriguez went 30 carries, 196 yards, 2 touchdowns, Longa 47 yards. If Alabama can run the ball, everything else goes quite well for them. And I will say against Tennessee, who was the 126th best pass defense, so not a very good pass defense. They lost 2 DBs in that game. They did, I think, find some rhythm offensively. Tennessee's rush defense had been quite good. Alabama did run the ball effectively on Tennessee. That allowed them to be balanced with the pass. I think Alabama's going to score points. I think it's realistic for Alabama to have something like 40 points in this game. And in particular, on the defensive side of the ball, this model has it about 18 points for Mississippi State. It's about what they scored against Kentucky. Mississippi State has gotten points in games where they've been able to really run the ball up the middle. Alabama is just a good bit better than a lot of the other run defenses in the SEC. Mississippi State caught Texas A&M when they had a couple defensive line starters out, and Adelaide and McKinley Jackson. That really put them back a notch and allowed Mississippi State to put up points in a game I'm not sure they otherwise would if Texas A&M had been fully healthy. Likewise, they kind of were able to jump on some other teams. And then there's games like the LSU game where things went very much the opposite. They are a streaky team, I think, in large part due to who they are and how much they focus on certain areas and certain aspects. Their secondary is good this year. Their pass rush is decent. The defensive line and front seven is not what it has been. And offensively, obviously, they are predicated on the pass. And if you can jam their receivers and you can play them with a good pass rush, you can sort of stop them. I think Alabama's scheme, for all its faults, is perfectly well suited to deal with Mississippi State. Those wide splits on the offensive line really allow Alabama's lack of size to be somewhat not an issue because they can shoot those gaps in the run or the pass. Alabama's speed on the outside is a real problem for those sets and alignments. Alabama probably going to do a lot of stunts and things like that to try to take advantage of those gaps. And the problem for Alabama with Tennessee was stack sets and downfield accuracy. Mississippi State is going to try to spread the field more evenly, but that lets Alabama line up more one-on-one. They can get more jams and disruption, and their athleticism and speed kind of limits the damage when you throw underneath. So I think defensively, Mississippi State's in a problem. I think offensively, they're going to be in a bit of a situation too. Alabama's probably going to continue to run the ball well. And in the passing game, again, they found some things. Isaiah Bond, who had a foot injury, started showing up for them in that game as a wide receiver. I think at this point, Prentice and Bond, the two freshmen for them, might be their best 2 wide receivers. You've seen Burton and Holden, the more senior guys, start to fall to the wayside. And, as time goes on, I think you're going to see more young receivers. And I think something I saw in the chat, which is definitely something worth considering, is some of the guys have had banged up as transfers. They had 2 other high-level transfers, Tyler Harrell, that we have not seen played in a game yet. He had a sprained foot in the midsummer. I said that's actually an injury, oddly enough, I suffered in mid-April. So I've kind of remembered that and stick to it. It took me 3 to 4 months to get over that injury. If you really sprain the tendon in your foot, it's just slow going. It does not heal very quickly. I imagine he's in the same situation, but I remember the reports were that somewhere around early October, he'd be able to practice. I think he has been practicing. I've heard he's been at warmups. Wouldn't shock me if we see him pretty soon in the lineup for them. The other one is Eli Ricks, and that's the big name of the day. I will say Alabama had 2 particular problems that compounded the schematic issues I was just talking about. The first issue is at corner, Terrion Arnold really struggled for them. He is a redshirt freshman. He was playing over Kyrie Jackson, who was the guy that got burned deep in the national title game. He was the one that got burned by Quinn Ewers. And Arnold had a terrible game. There was a play where he fell down and Hooker overthrew. I can't remember if it was Hyatt or Fant right now for a touchdown. There were other plays where he was consistently getting beat. A lot of stuff in the 10 to 20 yard range really was stuff that he was giving up. And then Helms at strong safety, I think, is a quality strong safety if we were in 2010 to 2012. He doesn't have a lot of long speed. He doesn't have great quickness. He struggles a little bit in the passing game. Alabama could use another high-level corner. And if they had another high-level corner, I don't know how much cross-training they've been able to do. That is a complicated system. There are situations where as people motion, you change from zone to man on each side of the field. The two halves of the field are called differently in that cover 7 route matching concept. So you can't just necessarily move from one to the other because you maybe know how to make the calls and how to make your adjustments in your spot, but you might not in another. But if Eli Ricks were to come on, one, I think he's a better corner than what they have in Terrion Arnold right now. I think Arnold's talent level is phenomenal, but he's a redshirt freshman. And last week he looked at Ricks has got a lot more live bullets. And if he understands the scheme, he can play at a higher level. And if he comes in, that lets them potentially play around more where Arnold and Branch are at. Because if they have some flexibility to move those guys around at free safety or corner, that would do wonders for them. I'm just not sure if that's something they can do, certainly short term or long term, but that's sort of where I'm at in terms of trying to figure out what those teams are going to be over the long haul. And I'll end here by giving my prediction. This score said 41-18. I think that's probably pretty realistic. I'll go with a number 41-17, Alabama, a 24-point margin there. I know the margin at Vegas is sitting at 20-something right now. Normally I'd have that number right in front of me, but it's a little harder when I'm the only one doing everything and looking at all the screens. So that's where I'm at with Alabama, Mississippi State. Everybody picked this one and wanted to discuss it. I think the LSU Ole Miss game, which was the other one, was definitely going to be a more exciting game and a more interesting one to me from the perspective of trying to tell which one of those teams is better, because I think Ole Miss got run over by Auburn to an extent nobody expected. LSU has looked both good and then terrible in alternating weeks, and now you get an Ole Miss offense that can do a lot of things schematically that Tennessee did to them and expose them. I think LSU's secondary has problems in their technique and understanding their scheme, and I think that's one that Ole Miss could pull out, and I also think it's one that LSU could just straight out athlete them. But right now, Alabama and Mississippi State, I think, are headed in different directions. And yeah, Alabama still looks like the class in the West. So with that, let's go ahead and transition now to the next game, and that is Texas versus Oklahoma State. The Texas Sooners come off a very narrow win over Iowa State. That was one I watched with some interest because it was kind of exciting. You had things like the late game fumble that they wanted to say was targeting. I'll be honest, I didn't really think that one was targeting. It definitely was more shoulder. Certainly didn't think that was as close a call as some of the ones in the Alabama game we just discussed from the prior week. There's some of those calls I was a little surprised they weren't called targeting. But Texas showed who they were, and they showed that they were the team that I've kind of been saying that they would be. They're a high talent team. They have some really good skill position players. When they're executing at a high level, they can score a lot of points. Their team really is based off Bijan Robinson and his ability to run the ball. Everything they did against Iowa State was predicated on running the ball first, anytime they had numbers, and they ran it even sometimes when they didn't have numbers. And the amazing thing with Bijan Robinson, really, he has big plays and he has explosive plays, but his consistency and his efficiency as a runner is special. And his ability to keep them on correct down and distance allows them to do the sorts of things that they want to do schematically to create advantages. My personal opinion of Quinn Ewers is, as a quarterback, he is an excellent tool for an offensive coordinator. I don't know right now if he is an excellent game manager of an offense, but that's not usually what Texas wants him to do. And I think you saw that a little bit in that game. You know, the big play to me was the screen pass that gets blown up. His guy's behind him. He realizes it's dead, and he spikes the ball backwards. Luckily for Texas, Ewers dove on that ball. Otherwise, that could have been disastrous. Probably could have lost them the game. And that's sort of a reflection of the fact that Quinn Ewers doesn't 100% understand everything that they want to do. So I think personally, when you talk about Texas, it's going to be predicated whether or not they can stay in good down and distance, whether they can keep the defense on their heels through the run game. If you can do that, Quinn Ewers is a guy that if he's throwing an open receiver, he can be anywhere on the field. He can do it with a flick of his wrist and accuracy and consistency to a degree that Card can't do. If Ewers is in a position where there is pressure, where he is having to throw in obvious passing situations, what I saw from him was something I kind of had expected from very limited snapshots, and that is that Ewers struggles a little bit coming off his primary read, coming off his normal timing, and making smart, sound decisions with the football. He did not always see crossers or short, 5 to 7 yard plays that were open for easy completions. He tends to try to take deep shots even when they're not there. I would say he's a much better version of Haynes King, but has the same problem, which is Haynes King is going to throw the ball for Texas A&M wherever his primary read is every single time. Quinn Ewers kind of does a little bit of the same thing. Again, far better player. I am not comparing the two. I'm just saying the flaw is a little similar from a mental aspect in terms of their progressions. The interesting angle to this game is really, I think, Oklahoma State and the health of the team. Spencer Sanders did everything for them last week against TCU. And I think really the takeaway for me is they are going to live and die by the consistency they get from Spencer Sanders, and this week probably by his health. You could tell the end of the game he was not 100% healthy. Their offense kind of bogged down in the second half. They were on fire. They were leading 24-13 at the end of the first half, did not score in the fourth quarter, and I think that had almost entirely to do with the general health of Spencer Sanders in this game. Ends up ending the game 16 of 36 for one touchdown and one interception. And this gets to something else that I want to say, especially for Oklahoma State, but really for both teams. If you go watch a highlight video of these programs or highlight clips of any one of these games, you're going to take away a certain impression of these quarterbacks and these offenses. And these quarterbacks are both going to look absolutely phenomenal. These quarterbacks get separated the most when you look at the plays that don't make your 15-minute highlight, your 20-minute highlight. Spencer Sanders' problem is not the highlight plays, and he's gotten a lot better at the negative plays. He had an interception in this game, but he was a little more prone to that sort of thing when he was a younger player. At this point, he's a pretty steady hand. His problem is the routine play. They miss on plays where they've got an easy completion or they've got a guy that he should be able to hit. They don't always hit him. They have misses deep. They've got little things that cause you to have missed plays, empty plays, that get you behind down in distance, that gets you into problems, that causes drives to stall. We saw that a little bit with Texas. Their stats last week against Iowa State, incredibly gaudy. I mean, Ewers was, at one point, I think he was like 10 yards per attempt, and they weren't scoring many points. I wasn't sure I think there was a point where he was like 8 to 10 yards per attempt, and then no touchdowns scored by Texas, 0 points on the board. And that's because consistency in your offensive production is just as important as explosiveness, unless you are actually scoring. Both these teams are going to have to win that battle to be overly successful. Both these teams are going to have to be efficient as much as explosive. I think Oklahoma State in particular does not have as many weapons, I think, as Texas does. Sanders at tight end for Texas, combined with Worthy, combined with Bijan, the ability to rotate in Roshan, all that lends itself to an offense that's going to be very, very effective. And I think Whittingham's finally starting to look like a 5-star receiver for them. I don't think Oklahoma State has the same players. Richardson is a good running back. Don't get me wrong, but like last week, sub 4 yards per carry. Receiving, Richardson ends up leading the team in receiving, and I think that says a lot. The rest of the receiving core, it's solid by Big 12 standards, but it's not necessarily an impact receiving core when we're talking top 10 competition. This is a little bit of a different level. And the other thing I will say with Texas is that Texas defensively is a little bit of a different matchup. Texas's problems come when you play small ball. I don't know that Texas really does a great job of always fitting everything right schematically. They've got a lot of bigger players due to having high-level athletes, and I think sometimes struggle a little bit in space and turning their hips and things like that. Some of that were bad evaluations, I think, coming from prior coaching staffs. But where Texas excels is if you want to just out-physical them, they are going to be bigger than you. They're going to be stronger than you. They start to look like the number 5 team in the country in overall talent that they are. And I think that's kind of the issue for Oklahoma State and why this game is so evenly matched up. So doing the same thing I did before, I can throw up another overlay here. So here is the Texas Oklahoma State model. Go ahead and cover up my ugly face. It's currently looking sideways. And you can see it's awful close in our model here, 37-35, Texas over Oklahoma State. That's pretty darn close to the spread, right? Everybody says the spread, which has been hovering around 3 to 4 points, is due to the Spencer Sanders injury, and I do think there's some truth to it. But I find it interesting that the model is so close here. And you can see defensively, the numbers are a lot better for Texas. I think Texas's defense is one of the more underrated units in the country. Everyone remembers that Texas Tech game when they lost and they gave up points late. But the truth is, statistically in that game, Texas played a really good game. They didn't give up a lot of yardage per play. And more than anything, it was just the sheer number of possessions where with Hudson Card, who still had a sprained ankle, they just didn't move the ball very well. But, 331 yards passing sounds like a lot. It's not much when it's 56 attempts, right? You're looking at 6-7 yards per attempt, really about 6 yards per attempt. They've been very, very good defensively. Oklahoma State has been a lot more shaky. Against the run, 92% is very average. 104% is a poor performance. This is an Oklahoma State defense that is shaky, playing a Texas team that has a good defense. I think Oklahoma State's offense on the whole is a little more complete. I think schematically they know what they're doing a little better. They're a little more in jive. Every player on that field can get the ball. Texas is more about featuring their skill position players and the elite athleticism they have. But this gets me to my ultimate point here. The combination of factors at play in this game as compared to like my model really starts to make me lean Texas. Oklahoma State has a banged up quarterback. Texas is a team where when you look at my model or you look at anything that's trying to do projections is based in large part off half the season being without Quinn Ewers. And to me, the Ewers injury is big, right? And people talk about the Alabama-Texas game, and especially out of this Tennessee game, they're saying, well, that's what Alabama would have been. I don't know that that's 100% fair because the reality for Texas and what they were trying to do, yeah, they might have beaten Alabama's corners, but they weren't doing it in the same way Tennessee was. It was more about athleting the corners for Alabama one-on-one. Tennessee scored by getting single matchups on safeties. The biggest problem for Texas in that Alabama game was that Hudson Card got hurt. And that's what's been crippling them offensively for a few weeks. Even when he played in view of viewers, everybody just forgets that he was on a bomb ankle. And that took away any ability to throw the ball deep, which kept them from spreading Alabama out. I think that's why they lost the Alabama game. I think they could have probably won that game with Card if he'd stayed healthy. But without him, you don't know. Maybe Ewers lights up Alabama. What they did in that game was just isolating corners one-on-one early on. Alabama made switches at corners. I don't know. That's not how Tennessee beat them. I wouldn't go that far. And I think Tennessee fans and Texas fans are always going to sort of try to play games with a what if there. But my thing from a modeling perspective for talking about where Texas's ceiling is, too many T teams, is really based off the fact that Card was injured for a while, and that really put a limiter on their offense, their ability to go vertical, their ability to move the quarterback around. Ewers is a much better athlete than an injured Card, and he is somebody that can throw the ball over the field. For an Oklahoma State defense that's been in a little bit of a funk, I think, this year, I think that's probably, frankly, probably a little bit too much. I think Oklahoma State's going to score points. I think they're going to stay in this game. But, as our model said, I just think Texas has the edge overall, and I think it's even amplified a little bit here. I'm going to go with a score of 41-31 Texas. I'll be curious to see if it's a lower scoring game. I could easily see it being so. I'm going to pull up. I haven't even looked at the point spreads for most of these somewhat intentionally. But let's see here. What's the over-under? It wouldn't shock me if the over-under here is actually going to be somewhat low. So the score I gave, 31-41, would be a 72-point over-under, right? That's what it'd be hovering around. I bet it's lower than that. Yep, and then it's 64. It's about a touchdown less. So if you look at our model, which has this at 71 points, it's basically saying, yeah, these teams are probably a little more prone to slow down than you would think. I think it's probably going to turn out to be a situation where you see a lot of warts in both teams, but I also think Texas is going to struggle a little bit with Oklahoma State's ability to improvise. I just think Sanders, I imagine Sanders will play, but he was awful beat up at the end of that last game. I don't think he will be 100%. I think he'll look pretty good, but not 100%. And I think that's going to be enough for Texas to win this game. And I think Texas was just going to continue to survive in advance. And you're going to see the potential every game, but I also think the number of young players on that team, all around, quarterback, offensive line, and really what I think is a roster that's still not fully fleshed out is going to limit them. So with that, I'd like to transition on now, and we'll move on to the UCLA and Oregon game. Now, this is an interesting one, UCLA and Oregon, one that we've not covered so much for either team, but it's worth taking a breath and trying to talk a little bit about who these two teams are, how they arrived at who they are as offenses. UCLA, as a football team, has been mainly predicated around the run. That's Chip Kelly's scheme. That's what they have with Dorian DTR, right, in the backfield, combined with Charbonnet. And what we saw against Utah a couple games ago, I think more than anything, was the fact that once they get going and they get going and they get going, it is really hard to maintain your momentum against UCLA and not get worn down because it just keeps coming. And I think the most impressive thing about UCLA this year is that they finally kind of got things figured out a little bit on how they want their passing game to run. Thompson Robinson has not always been a very accurate passer. When he was first put in that position, I was pretty negative on him. I don't think he understood the passing game very well. He was prone to a lot of mistakes, and he was very inconsistent. As the offensive line and running backs and quarterback get more and more on the same page about how to run this run-based offense, what it's done is it's opened up better passing lanes. If you're using DTR as a complementary passer, meaning someone that is primarily a running threat, that is throwing the ball to players that are coming open as easy reads off the run game, he can be extremely effective. He is a phenomenal athlete. And even though, again, you don't have to use him that much. In that Utah game, he only had 8 yards in the game. Charbonnet had 198. Just the threat of him running holds a defender. And then if you have the ability to run the ball effectively with your running back on top of that, you can be very, very effective as an offense. The thing that I think has held UCLA back a little bit is I don't know that their defense is so great. UCLA a few years ago, or the past couple of years, has really benefited from the fact that we've been in COVID numbers. They've had, particularly in the year they beat LSU, one of the more senior-laden defenses in recent memory. And that's really been an advantage for UCLA in a lot of games because of the amount of experience they've had. And they're good, but I don't think they're nearly as good this year. It's hidden a little bit from the quality competition. Bowling Green, Alabama State, South Alabama, Colorado, not teams that can threaten you, especially offensively. Washington, also not really a great offensive team. They're maybe competent. They also exist in that sort of weird bubble I've talked about, Washington and Wisconsin. And there's sort of this group of teams, BYU's thrown in there, that have all played each other, Baylor, and none of them have turned out to be very good. So there's a kind of a group of teams that we didn't really, I think, quite appreciate where they were at. Utah was the best team, the most physical team. A team that still lost to Florida, but a good team that plays physical football. And for UCLA to line up and run over them was impressive. But for them to give up 6.22 yards per play to Utah, maybe a little less impressive. And again, to sort of put some context on that number, 6.22 yards per play really was about average. They average about 6.7 yards per play on the season. That's inflated by the Southern Utah game. I think on a FBS basis, they're close to 6.2, about the same they gave up to Florida, or about the same they gained, I should say, against Florida, a little less than they gained against Southern Cal. And that kind of really, I think, highlights the nature of this game. Is UCLA is a team that offensively has a great run game. They have a good complementary passing game. They have a defense that's fine. I think they're fine. I think they can play pretty balanced defense, but 192 yards rushing to Utah, 287 yards passing. Not something that's going to necessarily wow anyone. As somebody's just said in chat, the run game is legit. The defense is suspect. And I would say legit and not legit. The other side of the ball, I think, is one of the more confusing teams in college football this year, and that would be your Oregon Ducks. Oregon obviously started the season by laying an egg, pun intended, against Georgia. And the thing that really struck me in that game was how easy it was for Georgia. A lot of people focused on the athletic differential between these two teams. They focus on the way that Georgia was able to do things like, have a tight end in Darnell Washington that's hurtling over a corner as he rumbles down the field. What struck me was, especially in the passing game, how easy they made it for Georgia to just find an open guy and hit him. And I've seen some signs of this being better, but the problem is the level of competition they've played hasn't really been enough to fully establish in my mind where their limitations are or aren't. The last couple of weeks, Stanford and Arizona, they've given up 5.4, 5.7 yards per attempt. Stanford's a dreadful team. Arizona is not a good team. Before then, you played Washington State, who had a pretty reasonable game throwing the football, scored 41 points in that game, 375 yards passing. BYU, who is a good offense, I think threw for about 305, 7.4 per. Nothing close to that 11.9 yard per attempt, 439 yard game from Georgia, but certainly some signs that are a little troubling. I think the biggest thing with UCLA is that they're going to be able to sort of strain Oregon with their run game enough to sort of limit Oregon's ability to leverage some of their high talent players. I mean, the advantage that Oregon has over a lot of teams in that conference is that Oregon has probably at this point the most high level talent in the Pac-12. I mean, I don't know. I think USC may be technically higher in overall team talent, but the number of really high level players on the defense is pretty impressive. Noah Sewell, Justin Flo, guys like that make a big difference for you as a defense. And what that's done is it's kind of allowed them to sort of hold things together because they can run the teams, they can hit teams. UCLA is going to hit them in the mouth physically, and they're going to test that manhood a little bit. And what that's going to do is it's going to strain Oregon's ability to play defense in the back end. And as that happens, you're going to really start to see how many things that Oregon was really able to figure out defensively, because now they're going to get more isolation coverages. They're going to be a little bit less sound, and you start to see if those pop passes hit. So before I get in my prediction, I'd be remiss if I didn't get into our model. So I'll throw our model up here again, and forgive the wonky graphics. I'm trying to do this on the fly. Daniel has most of our production stuff in-house, and I'm also trying to do this live, so I'm trying to find a way to make this work. It's lopsided here, guys. UCLA 38, Oregon 12. But the score doesn't really at all match the numbers otherwise. You see 6.75 yards per play for UCLA, 6 for Oregon. The defensive numbers for UCLA are a good bit better, 82% rush, 88% pass. Oregon, 85% rush, 95% pass. This is one of those games where our model is basically saying one team is way better at converting yards to points than the other. If you want to think of it this way, this is the Bo Nix effect, ladies and gentlemen. The model is saying that Oregon can find a way to have a game where things aren't quite going the way they want it to go, and the whole offense may shut down. 6 yards per attempt 6 yards per play is a pretty good number. It is also the second lowest number they've had outside the Georgia game. And what our model is trying to sort of extrapolate here is, as it flows below, really, they've been 7 yards per play every game BYU on. Once they lose just a yard, how fast does that start to take away from their ability to get first downs? How fast does that start to cause them to have negative plays? Personally, I think this model is an overreaction. I don't think that this is really realistic in terms of where they're at. I always often say this, that the scoring model is a little wonky. We could have a long conversation about priors. I don't use priors because I like to see what the model says based off only this year's results. But I only do that with the knowledge that I'm not using priors. I'm not using recruiting rankings. And sometimes it's going to give you a weird number, and you got to know when to throw it out. So as a talking point, I think this model is pretty entertaining. As an actual model that is showing you who's going to win, I'm not so sure it is. So, where do I actually land on this prediction? By the way, I have to laugh. Someone says Nix is a great game manager, in my opinion. And Zach Hayes, I love you, man. I've seen a lot of Bo Nix, and Bo Nix, game manager, not exactly the way I would describe him. Yeah, the spread is currently Oregon by 6, despite this. Now, most analytics, ours, and I will tell you other models, generally favor UCLA in this game. I think it has a lot to do with the schemes that they play. It has to do with where Oregon maybe has or has not improved. And they're essentially saying, look, UCLA does not run a traditional passing offense. And if Oregon has an Achilles heel, in my opinion, it's that I think their secondary may have some real problems. I think even when Oregon gets to the end of the season and they end up in a game against really high-level competition, I think they could get exposed again, much like they did in the Georgia game. They're lucky this year that they dodge USC, and that's going to kind of keep that from being exploited. If I'm right in that, it may never really even come up. The end of the year with Utah, maybe Cam Rising has some ability to run a high-level offense, but there's not many offenses in the Pac-12 that have high-level quarterback play and really high-level skill position talent to threaten you in the passing game. Ironically, it's just sort of the way the talent level's fallen. Personally, this is an area where I would go against Vegas. Vegas has Oregon by 6. I actually like UCLA straight up. I think Oregon is playing better football. There are reasons to believe in Oregon athletically. I think the talent level they have at linebacker, I'm starting to talk myself out of this a little bit, but that's going to allow them to deal with DTR more readily. It's going to allow them to deal with Charbonnet. I just don't necessarily trust this Oregon team with Bo Nix in a game like this to be able to sustain for 4 quarters. I think at the end of the game, Oregon's going to start getting tired. UCLA is going to start moving the ball well. And if they do that, they can easily give up some shot plays over the top. I'm going to go with the upset in this game with UCLA getting some time to rest, coming in against Oregon. I think they come in on all cylinders. I think UCLA wins the game. Do I think it's 38-12? No, not at all. I'm going to pick UCLA 34-31. And it won't shock me at all if Oregon wins the game. Again, a 6-point spread, you're looking at about a 2 out of 3 chance is what Vegas is saying that Oregon will win it. I don't think that's unrealistic, and I think I see where they're coming from, particularly the ability that Oregon has to play sideline to sideline due to their talent, their talent on the defensive side of the ball, their size, striking ability. And offensively, they can do a lot of things that UCLA hasn't seen that much of. I just think UCLA is a more physical, sound team. I think Oregon defensively has some cracks. I think those may show in a game where UCLA's run game is going to strain them over 4 quarters. And if I were to go to a reach prediction, which don't quote me on this, it's that I could easily see Oregon be leading at the half and lose the game. That's the kind of game that I'm envisioning. But it's one of the more interesting games. I think I'm kind of glad that people wanted to see this because I think this game is probably one of the more telling ones, one of the more interesting ones in terms of trying to gauge where teams are at within the Pac-12 and even nationally when you start to extrapolate who these teams are, who they've played like Georgia, and then how those teams have played other teams. It's a very interesting game from the greater sort of landscape of college football. But I'm going to go with Casey Knox here with a point that he just made because I think it's pretty apt. Bo Nix doesn't show up for big games. That's a fact. UCLA, man, it's hard to argue with. Bo Nix has struggled in games like this. He's struggled in situations where the other team is putting slow pressure on his offense to deliver. They did win some last year at Auburn playing like that, but I'm not going to trust him more often than not. I think I do think that UCLA finds a way to pull out the big one. And yeah, that's it. That's a wrap for me with these game previews. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't know if we'll do these too much, but if you enjoyed it, the sort of live aspect of it, let us know in the comments. As always, like and subscribe. If you've made it this long and you have not subscribed to our channel and you haven't liked this video, please do that. It helps us out a ton, helps us grow our channel. It helps us show up on feeds, show it to other people, post this in your forums. Things like that are really important for us as we grow. And we'll always keep getting at you. So, thanks again. I'll say Mike Farino with another super chat mentioning Bama and that Worthy could have done what Hyatt had done if they'd thrown the ball deep more. I think I touched on that earlier enough. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things like that in college football that are interesting one-off things, right? That we feel like a team is really good. Brown's defense in Michigan always look phenomenal. Would be a top 3 defense statistically. Go in the Ohio State game and get run out of the stadium. The reason for that is that if you have a limited scheme and you get really good at that scheme, you can be really good at what it's designed to stop. and you could be really bad at something else that we just don't know until you play them. We're at the point of the season where ain't nobody played nobody. We're going to start seeing a lot more results like that Tennessee-Alabama game. They're going to shock all of us. And, hey, we'll be right there with you watching it when it happens. So thanks, everybody. Have a great week. God bless.